In the quiet mountains of Montana, a battle-scarred veteran named Jack lived alone, believing his life had already passed him by. Until one freezing morning, a terrified woman stepped into his dog rescue carrying a secret so heavy it nearly destroyed her. But she wasn't alone. A German shepherd named Shadow, once abandoned, now fiercely loyal, slowly became her protector, her shield, her miracle. And what happens next is something even Jack never expected. A violent past returns. A small town rises up. And the broken begin to heal each other in the most unbelievable way. If you've ever prayed for a second chance or wondered whether God still sends angels into this world, this story will touch your heart. Please consider subscribing so you never miss another story of hope, faith, and healing. Thank you for watching, and may God bless you today. The late autumn wind swept down from the Montana mountains before sunrise, carrying a sharp cold that settled over the small town like a warning that winter was near. The sky was a pale steel blue, the grass coated with frost, and the only lights came from a distant diner and a flickering gas station sign. Beyond the last row of houses, a long dirt road cut between empty fields and thin pine trees, leading to a weathered farmhouse with a sagging porch and a crooked fence. A hand-painted sign hung near the gate. Second Chance Dog Rescue. Jack stepped onto the porch with a metal bucket of kibble in hand. In his early 50s, he still carried the strong frame of a former Marine, broad shoulders, solid posture. But his face showed the cost of years he rarely talked about. Gray streaked through his short brown hair, and lines carved deep around his eyes, the kind drawn not just by age but by memories of sand, smoke, and friends he never brought home. His jaw was shadowed with rough stubble, and there was a quiet vigilance in the way he scanned the yard, a habit he had never unlearned. The shelter was small and patched together with whatever he could gather. Reused fencing, mismatched bowls, blankets hung to block the wind. It wasn't pretty, but every corner was clean, cared for, and clearly loved. Shadow was the first to appear, stepping from his kennel with steady, powerful grace. A German shepherd around 5 years old, he had a thick black and tan coat, tall, alert ears, and intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing. A faint pale scar cut above his right eye, a reminder of the life he'd survived before Jack found him pacing a deserted parking lot. Ribs showing, waiting for an owner who never returned. Shadow brushed his head against Jack's hip in greeting, then followed him to the kennels. Jack moved from pen to pen, pouring food, checking water, murmuring soft greetings. Daisy, a medium brown mixed breed with gentle droopy eyes, wagged her tail shyly. Bruno, an older black Labrador with a graying muzzle and a limp from an old injury, lifted his head in calm recognition. Lily, a wiry white terrier mix with one ear permanently flopped sideways, bounced with restless eagerness. Each dog had its own history of abandonment or loss, but here they were given warmth, routine, and a chance to trust again. Jack understood them more than he understood people. After leaving the Marines, he had struggled to find a place where silence didn't feel heavy and loud noises didn't make his chest tighten. When his parents died and left him the farmhouse, he discovered that saving broken animals gave him the sense of purpose he'd been missing. The rescue was poor, built on donations and his own labor, but it was honest work. Feeding, cleaning, repairing, comforting, and it anchored him in a way nothing else had. By mid-morning, the sun had pushed above the mountains, spreading a soft gold across the frosted yard. Jack finished checking the fences and sorting donated blankets when he heard an unfamiliar engine rumbling up the dirt road. Shadow perked up immediately, posture alert but calm. A dusty sedan rolled to a stop near the gate. The driver's door opened, and a woman in her early 40s stepped out. She was tall, with a firm, professional posture. Her light brown hair was tied into a neat low bun, and thin glasses framed her observant eyes. She wore a wool coat, slacks, and sensible shoes. Practical clothing for someone used to field visits. This was Sarah, a local social worker Jack had seen around town, known for her calm steadiness and weary kindness. She offered Jack a small nod before turning toward the passenger side. The second door opened slowly. A woman in her early 30s stepped out, moving with the uncertainty of someone who expected the world to snap at her if she took one wrong step. She was slender, too slender, her shoulders drawn inward, as if trying to make herself smaller. Her dark blonde hair, pulled into a simple ponytail, allowed loose strands to fall around her pale face. Her hazel eyes carried exhaustion and caution, and faint shadows rested beneath them from nights without sleep. She wore a long, slightly oversized coat, jeans, and worn sneakers. Her right hand clutched the strap of a canvas bag so tightly her knuckles had turned white. There were subtle traces of her recent past. A thin scar along her jawline, a faint discoloration near her temple, the quick flinch she made at the sound of the car door closing. She looked like someone who was used to apologizing for simply existing. "This is Grace," Sarah said gently as she approached the gate. "She's looking for a place to help out for a while. Somewhere quiet." Jack opened the gate, motioning Shadow to stay close. The dog obeyed, watching Grace with steady curiosity rather than suspicion. Sarah continued, lowering her voice. "Grace recently left a violent marriage. She's safe now, but she needs time, space to start rebuilding. I thought the rescue might be good for her. The dogs here, they're good with people who've been hurt." Jack studied Grace, not in a judging way, but with the quiet understanding of someone who had seen fear before. Her posture, the way she held her breath, the way her eyes darted and retreated, he recognized all of it. He cleared his throat. "You like dogs?" Grace swallowed, then nodded. Her voice came out soft, fragile. "They're easier to trust than people." Jack's expression softened. "Can't argue with that." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the yard. "We don't have much, but if you're willing to help, there's always work to do." Grace hesitated only a heartbeat, then stepped through the gate. Shadow took a slow step forward, tail giving one small wag, a gesture of welcome. Grace's shoulders relaxed by the smallest margin, and in that cold Montana morning, at the entrance of a humble dog, rescue, a scarred Marine, a frightened woman, and a loyal German shepherd all took the first quiet step toward the second chance none of them had known they needed. Grace's first full day at the rescue began under a dull Montana sky, the clouds hanging low as if pressing the cold into the ground itself. She stood near the kennel fence with her hands tucked inside her oversized coat, watching Jack explain the morning routine. Though he spoke calmly, spacing out his words in a way meant to ease her nerves, she kept her gaze lowered, nodding quietly. Her movements were small, controlled, the movements of someone trying not to take up space. Shadow watched her from beside Jack, his posture steady and alert. He didn't growl or retreat, but he also didn't approach. His ears twitched toward her, studying the shape of her steps, the rhythm of her breathing, the way she flinched every time a louder bark erupted from another kennel. He was cautious, mirroring her wariness, as though recognizing a kind of brokenness he had once carried himself. Grace started her tasks slowly. Jack showed her how to portion food, how much water to give each dog, and how to secure the latches so none of the trickier dogs, like Lily, pushed their way out. Grace followed every instruction carefully, almost fearfully, as if a single mistake might bring punishment. When she set a bowl down too quickly and it clattered against the metal frame, she gasped and jerked backward, shoulders rising as though expecting someone to yell. Jack saw it. He didn't comment, only adjusted the bowl quietly and said, "Good job." The words made her blink in confusion, as though praise was a language she hadn't heard in years. Throughout the morning, she worked in silence, giving each dog space. Daisy, gentle as always, sniffed her hand and leaned forward for a shy nuzzle. Grace froze, then let Daisy rest her warm head against her palm. Bruno simply watched her with soft, aging eyes, and Lily darted around excitedly, but kept enough distance not to startle her. Every sudden noise, gates clinking shut, a truck backfiring on the road, a dog barking sharply, made Grace's breath hitch. There were moments when her hazel eyes widened, unfocused, as though she had been transported somewhere else entirely. Moments when her shoulders trembled from memories resurfacing, uninvited and sharp. Jack noticed, but he didn't push. He spoke only when needed, offering small instructions, checking the fencing, or repairing the cracked edge of a water trough. Whenever someone from town stopped by, dropping off blankets or food, Grace immediately stepped away, shrinking into the background like a shadow fading into the wall. Sarah visited briefly that afternoon, wearing her usual wool coat and carrying a clipboard. She checked on Grace, spoke to Jack about paperwork, and offered Grace a warm, knowing smile. Grace tried to smile back, but only managed a tiny, strained nod. After Sarah left, the yard felt oddly quiet without her steady presence. Hours passed, and though Grace still avoided speaking, Jack saw something subtle changing. The dogs were beginning to accept her, and in their own wordless way, were trying to help her settle. But it was Shadow who noticed her the most. Whenever Grace sat on the far bench near the pine tree, her favorite spot because it allowed her back to rest against something solid, Shadow would wander closer, stopping a few steps away. He didn't force contact. He simply sat there, eyes half-lidded, pretending to nap while keeping her in his line of sight. She never thanked him aloud, but on the second afternoon, when she thought Jack wasn't looking, she whispered soft words into the wind near Shadow's ear. The dog closed his eyes, accepting the offering of quiet trust. Jack pretended not to notice, but the corner of his mouth lifted. That night the weather turned fierce. Heavy rain slashed against the roof, and lightning flickered behind thick clouds. The storm knocked out the power, swallowing the farmhouse in darkness. Jack lit a flashlight and was checking the generator when he heard it. A scream, sharp, panicked, strangled by fear. Grace. He hurried across the yard toward the small volunteer room they had set up inside the old barn's converted loft. But when he reached the door, he hesitated. Bursting in might terrify her even more. He raised his hand to knock, then Shadow darted past him, shoving the door open with his nose. Grace sat on the bed, trembling violently, hands clamped over her ears, eyes wide with terror as the storm thundered overhead. Her breath came in short, painful gasps, as if each inhale scraped her raw. Shadow leaped onto the bed, placing his front paws gently beside her. He nudged her shoulder, then pressed his head firmly into her chest. Grace latched onto him instantly, burying her face in his thick fur, clinging to him as though he were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. Jack stood in the doorway, the flashlight beam lowered so he wouldn't blind her. He watched as Shadow stayed perfectly still, letting her sob, shake, and breathe into his warmth. When her breathing finally slowed, still shaky but human again, Shadow curled himself against her side, forming a protective barrier between her and the storm. Jack whispered, "Good boy," then stepped back quietly, closing the door without a sound. By morning, the storm had passed. Grace walked out onto the porch with swollen eyes but steadier steps. Shadow followed close behind, his tail swaying softly. She sat on the wooden steps, resting one hand gently on the dog's back as he leaned against her. Jack watched from across the yard while tightening a fence post. He didn't approach, didn't interrupt. He simply observed the way Grace's eyes, once frantic and searching, now softened when she looked at Shadow. Shadow was giving her something Jack couldn't offer yet: safety without fear, closeness without pressure, presence without expectation. And Jack, a man who knew the value of silent protection, understood exactly how much that meant. The days after the storm settled into a quiet routine, the kind that stitched slowly into Grace's life like soft, steady thread. Montana's late autumn had turned crisp, the cold no longer biting but firm, keeping the air sharp and clean. Frost still coated the tops of the kennels in the early mornings, but sunlight broke through more generously, warming the yard just enough for the dogs to lounge outside. Grace moved differently now, still careful, still quiet, but not as brittle. Shadow often walked a step behind her, as if fulfilling a duty he had assigned to himself. Jack noticed the change before she did. One morning, after the dogs had finished their walk, he handed her a small pouch of treats. His voice was gentle, steady, the same tone he used when calming nervous rescue dogs. "Let's start with something simple," he said. "Training helps them trust. Helps us trust ourselves, too." Grace hesitated, clutching the pouch slightly too tightly. I don't know if I'll do it right." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and her eyes flickered downward. Jack shook his head lightly. "Here, you're allowed to get things wrong. Dogs don't care about perfect. They care about consistency, patience, kindness." Shadow sat in front of Grace, waiting. His posture was tall, attentive. He seemed to sense the importance of this exercise, lowering his head just slightly to soften his intensity. Grace took a breath, then said the single word Jack taught her: "Sit." The first time, her voice was so quiet the wind nearly swallowed it. Shadow tilted his head. She tried again, louder this time, though still shaky. Shadow lowered his rear to the ground instantly, obedient and calm. When Jack told her to reward him, she fumbled, dropping the treat before placing it in Shadow's mouth. He accepted it graciously, tail sweeping once across the dirt. Grace blinked in surprise. He listened. Jack smiled, faint but real. Of course he did. Try again. Each day they practiced. Sit, stay, come, wait. Grace slowly found a rhythm in giving commands. Her voice, though still soft, grew clearer. She stood straighter. She corrected mistakes with less panic. And every small success, every wag of Shadow's tail, every obedient stillness, was like a beam of warm light cutting through her long internal winter. The other dogs noticed her growing confidence, too. Daisy began greeting her with gentle nudges to the knee. Lily jumped around her ankles with joyful chaos, forcing Grace to laugh once or twice despite herself. Even Bruno lumbered toward her more often, leaning his weight against her leg in a silent show of trust. Some afternoons, while folding blankets or gathering toys, Grace's mind drifted unwillingly to the past. Her ex-husband had been a handsome man, tall, broad-shouldered, well-groomed, but his charm had been a thin shell hiding something rotten. He criticized everything she did, the way she cooked, the way she dressed, the way she breathed too loudly when anxious. At first, she had believed she could fix it, soften it, survive it. But criticism became cruelty. Cruelty became control. Control became pain. There were days he told her she would never be anything without him. Days he reminded her she was small, fragile, lucky he tolerated her at all. Those words had carved deep trenches in her confidence, leaving her convinced she was incapable of meaningful impact. But here at the quiet rescue on the edge of town, dogs who knew nothing of shame or ego responded to her patience. They didn't correct her, mock her, or diminish her. They simply accepted her. And little by little, she began accepting herself. One Saturday morning, a family pulled up in a truck to meet a dog Jack had listed for adoption, a frail older shepherd mix named Harvey. Harvey had cloudy gray eyes, missing patches of fur on his back, and a slow, uneven gait. Most visitors overlooked him. He was too old, too fragile, too tired. But Grace had spent extra time brushing him, warming his food, speaking softly to him so he wouldn't feel alone. Harvey trusted her more than anyone else. The family, a father with a kind belly laugh, a mother with warm freckles, and a young boy with unruly red hair, walked toward Harvey's kennel. The dog shrank back, overwhelmed. Grace knelt slowly, calling Harvey's name with gentle confidence. He approached her instantly, leaning his bony frame into her chest. The mother placed a hand over her heart. "He likes you so much," she said warmly. "If he trusts you, that tells me everything." The father nodded. "Honestly, we probably wouldn't have looked at him twice. But seeing how he responds to you, well, that changes things." Grace froze for a moment, stunned. Compliments felt foreign, like they were meant for someone else. Her eyes glistened as she looked down at Harvey, who nudged her chin gently. "Thank you," she whispered, voice trembling for a different reason this time, relief rather than fear. When the family completed the adoption papers, they thanked her again. Grace watched Harvey leave with them, tail wagging, and for the first time in years, she felt unmistakably useful, needed, valuable. That evening, while storing tools in the shed, Jack cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he said, tapping the old wooden wall. "I want to turn this place into another kennel. We're getting more calls, more dogs needing space." Grace brushed hair behind her ear, unsure if he was simply talking out loud. "It would be good. More room for them." Jack glanced at her, his expression sincere. "If you want, we could work on it together. I could use the help." Grace's eyes widened slightly, not in fear this time, but in disbelief. Someone wanted her help. Someone trusted her with building something that mattered. Yes," she said softly. "I'd like that." Jack nodded once, the way men do when something important has just been agreed upon. Shadow wagged his tail behind them, as if approving the new chapter quietly forming between the three of them. Montana shifted into a stretch of clear, crisp days, the kind where sunlight poured generously across the fields and the breeze carried the cool scent of pine and dust. The air was no longer harsh like early autumn, but bright and steady, giving Jack and Grace perfect weather to rebuild the rescue. The old shed behind the farmhouse, leaning, faded, half-eaten by time, became their main project. Jack brought out his toolbox, full of worn metal and memories, and Grace followed beside him with a stack of gloves and measuring tape, her steps more confident than weeks earlier. Together, they set new fence posts, tightening wires, replacing broken planks, and sanding down rough edges. Grace struggled at first to lift heavier boards, but Jack quietly adjusted tasks so she never felt like she'd failed. She fetched nails, held the measuring tape steady, painted the new boards with slow, careful strokes. Her movements were no longer shrinking. She stood straighter, spoke more clearly, and even laughed once when Lily stole her paintbrush and dashed across the yard with triumphant barks. Shadow remained a constant presence, patrolling the edges of the yard with a protective steadiness. Whenever Jack used loud tools, like the old drill whose motor rattled harshly, Grace stiffened, anxiety flickering across her face. Shadow responded instantly, positioning himself between her and the noise, tail low but relaxed, head turned toward her as if reassuring her it was safe. As the days passed, the rescue began to change visually. Jack replaced the sagging roof sheets on the shed, hammering them into place with practiced precision. Grace repainted the handcrafted sign, "Second Chance Dog Rescue," adding a small paw print beside the last letter. Her brushstrokes were steady, and when she stepped back to admire it, Jack caught the faintest glow of pride in her eyes. When supplies ran low, they drove into town. At the thrift shop, a cramped building run by an elderly woman named Mrs. Palmer, they gathered blankets, old rugs, and a couple of wooden pallets. Mrs. Palmer was short and round, with silver curls that puffed around her head and bright blue eyes that sparkled with mischief despite her age. She insisted they take extra blankets for the babies, her affectionate term for the shelter dogs, and slipped Grace a homemade cookie wrapped in wax paper. Grace accepted with a shy but warm smile. They visited a hardware store run by a tall, bald man named Alan, whose thick beard and deep voice gave him an intimidating look, though he was known for being gentle with stray animals. Alan had lost his own dog the previous year, and the grief softened him in quiet ways. When he learned they were expanding the rescue, he gave them discounted planks and a free box of nails, saying, "Use 'em well." Grace thanked him, and Alan gave her a nod full of respect. Back at the rescue, people from town began stopping by. Many had known Jack from years ago, but had rarely seen him engage so openly with the community. Now, seeing Grace working beside him, seeing the newly painted sign and the reshaped fences, they grew curious. Some came to drop off old blankets. Others simply stepped inside to say hello. Grace, though still shy, surprised herself by greeting them. Her voice was gentle but clear. She talked about Daisy's progress, about Lily's antics, about Bruno's quiet loyalty. When people complimented her dedication, she blushed, looked away for a second, but then whispered, "Thank you." One afternoon, Jack handed her a printed list of dogs needing descriptions for the rescue's online page. "You're better with words than you think," he said. "The way you talk to them, it matters. People will hear it." Grace spent evenings writing stories about each dog, where they came from, what made them afraid, what made them happy. Her writing wasn't flowery, but it was honest and warm, and the effect was immediate. Donations trickled in. Adoption requests increased. Strangers sent messages saying her words reminded them of their own pets, or of times they too needed a second chance. The rhythm of their days brought small, tender moments. When the wind turned colder, Jack quietly placed his own jacket around her shoulders without asking. She startled, but he simply said, "Wind's sharp today," and walked off before she could return it. When she forgot her coffee mug on the workbench, she later found it beside her door with a sticky note. remember to stay warm. Jay Shadow often walked between them when they led the dogs down the dirt road, as if keeping balance in the fragile connection forming. They didn't call it affection or attraction or anything at all, but it lived in the soft silences, in the shared glances, in the steady gentleness growing between them. Then came the day that tested everything. A dark blue truck rumbled into the yard, loud, unwelcome. Grace froze the moment she saw the driver step out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with neatly combed dark hair and a face sharpened by anger more than hard work. His eyes were cold, assessing, the kind that drilled into a person until they shrank. His name was Mark, her ex-husband. He walked with the entitled confidence of someone used to being obeyed. "Grace," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "You've caused enough trouble. You think hiding here will fix anything?" Grace's breath hitched. Her hands trembled. Old fears clawed their way up her throat. Jack stepped forward, expression unreadable but eyes sharp. "You need to leave." Mark scoffed. "This doesn't concern you." Shadow strode ahead of Jack, hackles rising, a low growl rumbling from his chest. His body formed a barrier between Grace and Mark. Neighbors who had come to drop off blankets paused at the gate. One of them, Alan from the hardware store, walked closer, arms crossed, towering with quiet intimidation. Mrs. Palmer stood behind him, her small frame radiating fierce protectiveness. "You should go," Alan said, voice low but steady. Mark glanced around and saw he no longer held control. He muttered something under his breath, glared at Grace with venomous frustration, then retreated to his truck and sped away. Grace's knees weakened. She leaned down, placing a trembling hand on Shadow's back. The dog pressed himself firmly against her, anchoring her to the ground. Jack stood nearby, watching her with gentle patience. She looked up at him, truly looked, and for the first time, her fear did not drown the moment. She was not alone anymore, and she would never be again. In the days following Mark's intrusion, the rescue settled into a new kind of quiet, one not born of fear, but of determination. Grace stood taller, moved with purpose, and no longer glanced over her shoulder at every sound. The confrontation had shaken her, but it had also crystallized something inside her. She would not run anymore. She would reclaim her life, and she would do it right here, on this patch of Montana soil where second chances grew like wildflowers between broken boards and muddy paws. Her first step was reaching out to a local attorney named Helen Briggs, a woman in her mid-50s known around town for her no-nonsense approach and fierce sense of justice. Helen had a stout build, short gray-streaked hair cut into a practical bob, and sharp brown eyes that missed nothing. Her voice carried the firmness of someone who had spent decades arguing in small-town courtrooms. When Grace sat in Helen's modest office, hands trembling slightly, the attorney listened patiently. "You're not alone," Helen said, sliding paperwork across the desk. "And you're not the first woman he's tried to intimidate. You're doing the right thing." Helen's steady presence gave Grace the confidence to file for a restraining order, backed by statements from Jack, Alan, and several neighbors who had seen Mark's behavior firsthand. With legal protection in motion, Grace returned to the rescue feeling more grounded. Jack didn't ask questions or pry. He simply walked beside her when she came through the gate. Shadow pressed against her leg like a loyal guardian. The three of them formed a quiet unit, stronger than the fear Mark had tried to ignite. A week later, under a bright Montana sky, Jack and Grace unveiled the newly repainted sign at the entrance of the rescue. Grace had added a subtitle in her careful handwriting: "A place for hearts with scars, dogs and people alike." Jack hadn't commented when she first proposed it. Instead, he just nodded slowly, his gaze softening. Now, as the sunlight caught the fresh paint, he said, "It fits, more than you know." To celebrate the new beginning, they organized an informal, open day. It wasn't anything grand, just an invitation posted online and on a few bulletin boards around town. But by noon, the yard was alive with voices and laughter. Children ran along the fence lines, giggling as Lily chased them in delighted circles. Older folks sat on folding chairs near the porch, stroking Bruno's soft ears while sharing stories of dogs they'd loved long ago. Daisy followed a group of teenagers who offered her treats, wagging her tail tentatively but happily. Shadow kept to Grace and Jack, occasionally greeting visitors with polite curiosity, but always circling back to his post beside Grace. Several new faces appeared. A man named Tommy, a former Marine like Jack, stopped by after reading Grace's online posts. He was in his 40s, lean with angular features and a close-cropped beard. His eyes carried the distant look of a man who'd seen deserts and battlefields. But when Bruno leaned against his leg, something warm flickered through his expression. "He reminds me of the dog we had on base," Tommy murmured. Jack clasped his shoulder, and the two shared the kind of quiet understanding only veterans recognized in one another. Another visitor, Marilyn, was a woman in her late 30s with soft curls and a gentle demeanor. She had faint bruising beneath makeup she applied carefully, but her smile grew stronger each time she petted Daisy. She whispered to Grace, voice trembling, "It helps. Being here. Being around someone who understands." Grace squeezed her hand lightly, offering the same comfort that had once been offered to her. Strangers and neighbors mingled, and the rescue, once quiet, once small, felt like a heartbeat of the community. Grace watched it unfold with quiet amazement. Her stories, her presence, her courage had helped build this. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Later, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, Jack helped a group of children toss balls for the dogs. His laughter, rare and unguarded, echoed through the yard. Grace watched him from the porch, her hand resting on Shadow's back. The dog leaned into her, sensing her calm. The golden light caught Jack's face just right, softening the hard angles that war and loneliness had etched into him. Grace approached him slowly, stopping beside him as the children ran off to chase Lily. Jack wiped his hands on his jeans, turning toward her. For a moment, neither spoke. The breeze tugged gently at Grace's hair. Shadow sat between them, tail sweeping the earth in lazy strokes. "Jack," she said softly, her voice steadier than she expected. "Thank you for everything, for giving me a place to breathe again, a place to start over." Jack shook his head slightly. "Grace, I didn't save you." His eyes drifted to Shadow, then back to her, warm and sincere. "Truth is, you and Shadow, you two saved me. I wasn't living before this, just getting by." Her eyes glistened, not with fear this time, but with something hopeful and earnest. They stood there in the fading light, the yard calm around them, the dogs settling into their evening routines. It wasn't a confession of love. It didn't need to be. It was the quiet promise of something growing, something steady and healing. As the last rays of sunlight brushed across the fresh rescue sign, Jack, Grace, and Shadow stood together at the gate. Behind them, the dogs roamed freely, their silhouettes soft against the warm horizon. The Montana breeze carried the scent of pine and earth, rustling the grass like a whispered blessing. The little rescue, once just a place for abandoned animals, had become a home for wounded souls finding their way back to trust. Sometimes, God sends miracles in ways we don't expect. Not as bright lights in the sky, not as loud voices from heaven, but as a wounded dog who refuses to give up, as a broken soul learning to stand again, or as two people who find healing in each other when the world thinks they're too far gone. Jack, Grace, and Shadow remind us that every scar, no matter how deep, is a doorway where God's light can enter. And in everyday life, each of us has our own battles. Some carry memories that won't fade. Some carry fears they never speak of. Some carry loneliness tucked behind quiet smiles. But just like the little rescue in Montana, healing often starts with the smallest things. A kind word, a gentle touch, a loyal friend, or simply choosing not to run from our pain anymore. If you're watching this right now, I want you to remember, God never abandons those with hurting hearts. He sends strength through people, comfort through animals, and hope through moments we often overlook. And maybe, just maybe, this video found you for a reason. If this story touched you, please share it, so someone out there who feels alone might feel God's warmth again. Leave a comment about the blessings in your life or someone you're praying for today. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you more stories of healing, faith, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your home, guide your heart, and may His miracles, big or small, find their way into your life today. Amen.